Hey, what's going on, guys? War Brothers Collectibles here. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another video. So I'm a massive fan of the Charles Dickens story, A Christmas Carol, and every year I try and watch the multiple film adaptations of the classic 1843 story. This year I decided to actually finally read the original novel of A Christmas Carol and see which one of my favourite film versions are closer to the book. For the purposes of this review, I'm going to include A Muppet's Christmas Carol, the Patrick Stewart version of A Christmas Carol, Albert Finney's Scrooge, and the Jim Carrey version of A Christmas Carol. I am aware that the old Alistair Sim version is regarded as the most faithful adaptation by many, but for this review, I'm just going to talk about those four versions that I've just mentioned, because they are the ones that I know the most. Firstly, I just want to say I do know the story and these films really well, but I am by no means an expert or any authority on Charles Dickens, so please accept my apologies if I do make some mistakes during this review. I really enjoyed the book and I read it over about the course of a week. It is written as if Charles Dickens is like directly speaking to you, the audience, the reader. He'll make direct references to you. For example, I must ask you to remember that Marley was dead. And that's one thing that in A Muppet's Christmas Carol that Gonzo does when he's narrating the story as Charles Dickens. The beginning of the novel is, of course, Scrooge working and Cratchit being cold and his nephew Fred paying Scrooge a visit. However, it's interesting to note here that they are only ever called the clerk or the nephew in this part of the book. The names are only mentioned later on in the story. In terms of the dialogue here, I would have to say that the Jim Carrey version is the most, like, word for word, like the book, and it is also very faithful. But the Patrick Stewart is also very close as well. The Muppets and Albert Finney expand on these scenes with songs and different characters being introduced. One difference here in the book that is not shown in any of my favourite film versions is that it mentions that Scrooge goes to a tavern for his dinner, and I quote, Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. There he read all the newspapers and spent the rest of the evening with his banker's book before he went home to go to bed. End quote. Whereas the film versions just show him going straight home from his office. I think this was an interesting little part of the book as it shows more of his isolation and indeed that he is really a solitary being. But, I do understand that that was probably cut for the films for pacing reasons because ultimately it doesn't really add anything major to the story apart from just seeing the character of Scrooge a little bit more and the way he is with people. One of the best lines of dialogue ever written, in my opinion, is when Marley's ghost visits Scrooge, and that line is, quote, the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. When I read that line, it was just so chilling to me, and I don't think that line will ever leave me. I was just like, wow, what a great line. Once again, the Jim Carrey and Patrick Stewart versions are the closest here, but I would have to give it to the Patrick Stewart version as it nails the Marley's ghost scene like incredibly well because it's pretty much word for word. Even everything that you see, like Scrooge seeing Marley's face on the fireplace tiles. The Patrick Stewart version of Marley is my favourite interpretation because it's played so brilliantly. You really feel for the character and that he is in so much regret and eternal torment for the actions that he did in his life. Whereas the Jim Carrey version, although the dialogue is very close, it's done more for like the 3D visuals and things like that. So moving on to talk a little bit about the three spirits that visit Scrooge. Robert Zemeckis, the director of the Jim Carrey version, said he always thought of the three ghosts as Scrooge's alter egos. That's why he gets Jim Carrey to play all the ghosts. But I really have to disagree with that. I really have to disagree with that approach. It's just very weird to see Jim Carrey playing all three ghosts and him trying different kind of British accents. He tries Irish, and it's just very strange. But from the descriptions of the ghosts in the novels, I do got to give it to the Patrick Stewart version as they are the most accurate as they are described in the novel. The Ghost of Christmas Present section is probably my favourite part of the novel, as it describes him and Scrooge travelling far and wide to see how people of all backgrounds enjoy Christmas. And they also visit the lighthouse and the ship. This is something that was also shown in the Patrick Stewart version that is recreated brilliantly in that film. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come is described as a large cloaked, hooded figure with one hand that kind of like points to things and shows Scrooge things just with the finger. Pretty much all the film versions portrayed the ghost that way. The Jim Carrey version plays it more out for the 3D visuals again, like with the ghost turning into a horse and chasing him to the different locations and then shrinking him down into a tiny size so he can get into different locations to Old Joe's and things like that. Of course, that does not happen in the book here, guys. That is just totally done for the visual entertainment in that Jim Carrey version. Overall, I really enjoyed the book. It's a very quick read, just over 100 pages, depending on which version you get, if it's illustrated or not. But my version was a collection of Charles Dickens stories. So the Christmas Carol in my book was about just over 100 pages, maybe 110 pages. But I'm so glad that I finally got around to reading it. I really enjoyed it thoroughly. If you're a huge fan of the films, I would say definitely check the book out. In terms of which film version is closer, I would have to give that to the Patrick Stewart version in terms of what actually takes place, what things that you see in the novel, translate straight into that film. And that is the closest in terms of the events of actually what happens. And then, although the Jim Carrey version takes many liberties with the visuals and changes some events around as well, that version is pretty much word for word spot on with the dialogue. So it depends what you want. I'd say the Patrick Stewart version is closer to the book, like in the visual regard and the events, but then the Jim Carrey version is old school word for word as it is written in the book, which is kind of interesting. But it's everyone has their own favorite version of A Christmas Carol, especially if you like the story. The Muppets version is brilliant. I love that movie so much. And I really enjoyed the Albert Finney version as well. That does something different. So if you're a fan of the Christmas Carol movies, definitely give this novel a go. It can be very hard to read sometimes, and some of the words are not really used in that context today. So it may help to have like a dictionary handy, or you might have to Google some of the words that he's used. It's a classic story, guys, and all the film versions I've seen do a great job in recreating it or do a great job making it their own. The musicals are amazing, so if you haven't seen them, definitely check them out. They do something different with the classic story, and yeah, they make it their own and make it their own special version. So it's a timeless classic, guys. So if you've never heard of A Christmas Carol, which I find hard to believe so, but if you haven't, definitely start watching the Christmas Carol films. And if you're really interested, check out the book. It was a really good read. So thanks very much for watching, guys, and listening to this review. Have a great holiday season. Merry Christmas. And as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.